Do you want to learn how to turn procedural materials into image textures inside of Blender, so you can then use them in other 3D softwares and other blend files? Well, in this quick YouTube course, you will learn how to bake your materials into different types of textures to use with shaders. In the 5 episodes, you'll learn how to make the base color map, responsible for the color of the shader, the roughness and gloss maps, which are responsible for the reflectivity of your shader, height maps, used for adding depth to our material. In Blender, we can use this with a bump node and with displacement nodes. So these texture baked maps can also be referred to as either displacement maps or bump maps, as well as height maps. And for the 5th video in this course, we'll cover normal maps. These also add depth to our material, but they're much more resource friendly than height maps. We'll cover the 2 main types of normal maps, called OpenGL and DirectX, since certain types of softwares use different normal maps. If baking is still a confusing concept to you, the video in the top right hand corner and description will give you a strong understanding of what texture baking means and what it's used for. This will act as a great introduction before starting this course. So, are you ready to learn about texture baking? Well, all episodes are out now for free on the Blender Inferno YouTube channel. So I'll see you in the first episode. Thank you for watching this trailer and take care. So Blender, the multi-purpose software that it is, has a really handy feature: baking. So what is a bake? Well, we're not talking about making pastries in Blender here. Rather, a bake in Blender refers to converting something into a saved form. What I mean by this is, for example, if you bake a cloth simulation, Blender calculates the position of the cloth at each frame and then saves the calculation as what we call cache. This means that when we play the animation, the simulation is already calculated, and Blender doesn't have to waste resources calculating the simulation every time you play it. In terms of baking, we're talking about taking material or normal data and converting it into an image. For example, I could bake the base color of this material and get an image that represents the material's base color. Now, as we learned in the last episode, a texture is an image of what you want a respective shader parameter to display, and can be used in many types of software, such as game engines, and Blender of course. Whereas a Blender material is something you make in Blender and can only use reliably within Blender. Usually we make a material in Blender and then bake it so we can use it in another software or within a new Blender file, without the need to append a material. So think of textures as converting a material into images. Now that sounds great, but what about this cross shape that the material has baked onto? Well, this here is called a UV, and the UV determines where the texture will be baked. This is important so the texture shows on the model how we would like it to. UVs are also a great way to make sure our resolution is the same all around the model. In order to make the UV, we want to do a process called UV unwrapping, which we will cover at a later date. Fortunately for us, cubes come with a UV made for us in Blender, so we can jump straight into baking. But first we need to see the UV. To see our UV layout in Blender, all I'm going to do is come to the top left hand corner and drag this out. Then I'll click on the top left hand corner drop down menu and change it from 3D viewport to UV editor. If you want to download this cube we made in the last episode, you can download the Blender file in the description below. Now I'm going to press tab to enter edit mode, and if I press A to select everything, you can see this cross shape I was talking about earlier. If I turn on these 2 arrows, it will mean when I select something in one of these modes, it will select it in the other. So I'm going to turn that on, and I'm going to select one of these faces. And now you can see, when I've selected this middle face here, it's selected it on the cube as well. So this tells us which face belongs to which UV. As I mentioned earlier, because Blender has given us this automatically, it means we don't have to do any UV unwrapping, which is handy. So let's go about baking this texture we made in the last episode. First thing I'm going to do is I can pick one of my materials. I'm going to do my spotty wallpaper first. Then I'm just going to press Shift and then A in the shader editor, come under texture, and I'm going to left click image texture. Then if I click this plus new, I can create a brand new image. Usually we work in 4K, but for this video I'm just going to work in 1K in order for time efficiency. I'm going to change it from untitled to base color. As you can see, I've spelt color as C-O-L-O-U-R. This is because I am located in the United Kingdom. If you're located in another English speaking country, it may be spelled as C-O-L-O-R. Now I'll press OK, and you can see we've got a bunch of drop downs here. I'm going to keep all these the same, and we'll have the color space as sRGB. Sometimes we want to set this to non-color for other types of what we call maps. Now we've done that, we're going to click on our render properties on the top of our properties menu, and under render engine, if you're on Eevee, make sure you switch to cycles. This is because Eevee can't actually bake textures, only Cycles is capable of doing that. Down here you can see we've got samples. Since this is a bake, we can actually turn this down really low and it will hardly affect the look of the texture, however it will render much faster. So I'm going to change my max samples on the render to 10. You don't need to change the max samples on the viewport, but for peace of mind you can easily do that. Then you'll see there's a tab here called Bake. This is where we do all of our texture bakes. I'm going to open this up and you can see there's a drop down here where we can select what type of bake we want to do. We have all sorts of different types of bakes, but for now I'm going to click Diffuse. This is essentially going to bake our base color. Diffuse is another term usually used to refer to a base color texture. Now under contributions, I'm going to turn off direct and indirect. What these are essentially the light that you may have inside your render view. So since we're just wanting to bake the color in our material, we're only going to want to have color enabled. Have a quick look and make sure these settings are the same, although they should be by default. Then all I'm going to do to bake is simply press bake. I recommend saving before you do this. Awesome, that's our bake complete. And as you can see, it's baked our spotty texture onto this image. If I press tab to go into edit mode, I can press A and you can see our cross here, and if I want to see our image underneath, I can just left click this drop down here, which looks like an image with a triangle on it, and I'm going to click our base color image. Now you can see what the bake has done. It's perfectly normal to find that it will bake a little bit over the edges. Don't worry, that's not going to negatively impact the texture, that's just something Blender seems to do. If you know why this is, I'd appreciate it if you let me know in the comments below. That's great, but we're missing a square here. We're missing the square here because this is on another material. So let's go ahead and fix that. So I'm going to press tab to go back into object mode. Then I'm going to left click on my material properties. Then if I come up, I'm going to left click on our material 1, which is the material we assigned to this square here. Fortunately, we can bake both these materials onto the one texture. So I'll press shift and then A. Then under texture, I'm going to left click image texture. I'm going to left click on this image drop down and select base color. Now I'm going to come back up to my render properties and we're ready to bake again. Keep all the settings the same and then just left click bake. Awesome, so it's finished baking and now you can see the texture is complete. One important thing we need to do is save our texture, since this texture isn't necessarily built into Blender. So if you see up here, there's an image with a star sign. This star sign on any type of software essentially means that it's not been saved. So for example, if I saw a star beside the Blender, it means that something has changed since it was last saved. So now I'm going to left click on this image drop down and I'm going to press save as, and then you can choose a directory to save your image. Now I'm going to create another cube to demonstrate the fruits of our labour. So I'll press shift and then A to bring up the add menu in the 3D viewport, and under mesh I'll left click cube. Then I'll press G and Y to move it along, and I'm going to create a brand new material for it. So I can come under either my material properties or my shader editor and just left click plus new. Then I can press shift and then A, texture, then left click image texture. Then I'm just going to left click our drop down and left click our base color. Then I'm going to connect the two color sockets like this, and now you can see our texture is now appearing on here. You will see it is a tiny bit more blurry, and that's because we baked it on a 1K texture, whereas usually the standard would be 4K. So do keep that in mind if you're baking textures at lower res. Our roughness setting is already at what we want it to be, and now we essentially have the exact same cube. However, our new one only needs one material and an image, whereas another one requires two separate materials and quite a few extra nodes. So as you might imagine, this one is a lot quicker to create. So what if I want to add an image texture from a file outside of Blender? Well, all I'm going to do is left click this X here, then I'm going to press open and a menu will open where you can find your image. If you want to try another example, I've left this gingerbread texture in the description below, which you can download, and you can try importing it into Blender if you want to practice. Otherwise, you can just watch. I'm going to left click open, and then find my texture in the file browser. Now I've added my nice gingerbread texture, which I made a little while ago. I'm going to turn the roughness up on this one since gingerbread is a lot rougher. But what about textures like these? What if I'm just repeating the same image on every square of the cube? Well, to do that, we're going to use a different type of UV called a cube projection. So I'm going to press A to select everything and just press H to hide. Then I'm going to press Shift and then A. I'm going to add a brand new cube. So I'm going to press plus new to add a new material. Now you can either drag and drop your image into Blender, or we can do the same thing where we press Shift A, go down to texture, left click image texture, left click open, and then just find your image. I have called this image wood base color.png. So just left click that and you can press open image when you find it. Then I'm going to connect the color to the base color. And then go into edit mode and select everything. Then I'll left click this image drop down in the UV editor and I'm going to select wood base color. So this is the texture we are using. Now I want to make every single square the size of the texture. This will both maximize the usage of the resolution and it will make sure our cube is scaled and rotated for each single UV square. So to do that, I'm going to press A to select everything in the 3D viewport in edit mode, and then I'm just going to press U, and this will bring up our UV mapping menu. Then I'm going to left click this option called cube projection. Now you can see it's turned into one big square, but these are actually all 6 of these squares stacked on top of each other. You'll also notice that some of them are rotated as well. So now we have the texture evenly distributed throughout the cube. To make sure this is working properly, we're going to use a texture coordinate. So I'm going to press Shift A in our shader editor, and I'm going to search for texture coordinate. I'll left click on that, and I'm going to drag the UV into the vector of this image texture. We will cover what vectors are in episode 4 of this course. That's great, but what if I think my wood is a little bit too small? Well, we can easily fix this. Press Tab to enter edit mode, press A, then if I press S, I can scale it down. So we're going to want to work in fractions here, and I'm going to press S and then type in 0.5. Then I'm going to press Tab to go back into object mode, and we can have a look at our cube. Now you can see the wood effect is much smaller. But what if I wanted to make it bigger? Well, we can do this as well, so I'll go into edit mode, select everything, then press S and then 2, and that'll scale it back up to its original size. But if I was to scale this up over the boundaries, this does work inside of Blender. Just keep in mind that you won't be able to do any texture painting or baking, and you may have some errors in other software. So I recommend always keeping the UV within the bounds of our image. So some of you might be wondering, then why was the image in the thumbnail not a single image? It's identical in each face, right? Well, actually, each one of these faces are unique, which is why I stuck with a basic cube unwrap that Blender has by default for the cube. And I also want to create a cool thumbnail. So some of you might be wondering, well, can we use an image to represent other parameters, such as maybe roughness, metal, or specular? Well, yes, we can. However, we're going to cover this in a later tutorial in the series, since it's a little bit more advanced. For now, we're going to wrap up the tutorial here and have a quick quiz. Number 1. What is a texture bake? Number 2. What is a UV map? Number 3. What is the difference between a texture and a material? You can pause the video to answer the questions, and I will go over the answers in 15 seconds from now. Number 1. What is a texture bake? A texture bake is an image that represents one of the parameters of our material. Today, we covered how to bake a base color texture, but there are other types of texture bakes as well, which we will cover later. Number 2. What is a UV map? A UV map is a 2D representation of our 3D object. It acts almost like a paper craft before it's turned into a 3D form. So you can think of a UV map as a flattened out version of our 3D object. This is really important for texture baking, so we can get an accurate texture to use in other software or other Blender files. Number 3. What is the difference between a texture and a material? Well, a texture is an image used to represent a certain parameter of a shader. They can be used in materials inside of Blender and in other software. A material, on the other hand, is something made in Blender, represented using nodes in the shader editor. Materials are mainly just reliable within the engine they were created in, so for example, a Blender material would only be reliably consistent inside of Blender. However, we can use a material to bake textures, which we can then use in other software. Awesome! Well done everyone on completing the second episode. If you have any questions, feel free to let me know in the comments below, and you can also comment your answers to the quiz in the comments below, and I'll mark them for you, and I'll answer all your questions to the best of my ability. Today, we're going to be baking the base color of this procedural material. If texture baking is a new concept to you, I recommend watching this video here. This will give you a rundown of what baking is. For now though, I'm going to jump straight into the tutorial. To start off, I'm going to press H to hide my cube. Press Shift A, under Mesh, I'll left click Cube. Then, if you have your shader editor open, which you can just click this drop down here if it's the timeline, and change it to the shader editor, or if I come to my material properties, I can click one of these drop downs beside the plus new, and I'll change it. After 30 seconds or so, it should load up. Now, I'm going to drag up my shader editor, and I'm going to press Shift A, then under Texture, I'll left click Image Texture. This is what I'm going to bake my base color onto. Then, in the top left hand corner, I'll drag this out, and I'm going to change this drop down from the 3D viewport to the UV editor. Then I'll press tab into edit mode, and now you can see our UV. We've got this default cross UV, but there's a slightly more optimal UV we can do using the Smart UV project. So I'll press A, U, and left click Smart UV project. Then I'll change my island margin to 0.03. Now we've got our UV set up, I'm going to press plus new on our image texture, and I'm going to call it base color. Here we can decide what the resolution of our image will be. We want to make it the same width as the height. Keep in mind, the higher the resolution, the more performance it will use inside of Blender and other softwares when being used as a texture. I want to change this to a 2K texture, so to do that I'm going to quickly drag and scroll down, and I'll press my right arrow key, press shift, then the 8 key to get a star icon, and then 2, and that will times that number by 2, and now we have 2048 by 2048. You can also just type these in manually. If you need to, you can check off this alpha button, but for now I'm not going to worry, and I'm just going to press OK. You can see in our UV editor, they've put the texture behind our UV. I'm going to keep my color space as sRGB. Color space is important, as some of the other bakes we'll do in future tutorials will use a different color space. Now I'm going to click my render properties, make sure I'm in cycles, since texture baking only happens in cycles. In my render settings, I'm going to change my min samples back down to 0 and a max sample 10, since for baking we don't need a high sample count. Down at the bottom here, I'm going to change my bake type from combined, which it should be by default, to diffuse. I'm going to make sure influence direct and indirect are off, because those are used for light maps. If you do encounter any issues when you're doing this, make sure all your settings are the same as mine. Then I'm going to press Ctrl S to save my file, since sometimes baking can cause Blender to crash, and I'll just press bake. After a couple minutes have passed, the bake should finish, and here we will have our result. Keep in mind, if you chose a much higher resolution when creating our image texture, for example a 4K texture, the bake will take a lot longer. But you can hover over the percentage to figure out the estimate of how long it will take. Keep in mind, my version of Blender is 3.6, and this may not be available in earlier versions. Now that's finished, we'll need to press Ctrl S to save our file, and we're also going to need to make sure we save our image, since if we were to close Blender, the image would not be saved since it's not packed into Blender. So I'll press image, and then I'll choose save as, and I can find a location on my computer to save the image. You'll also notice how our image has this checkered pattern underneath, and that's because we checked the alpha option when creating our image texture. There's two steps to using our image texture in Blender. If I was to remove the base color from our color ramp and then plug in the base color into the base color of the shader, and now I can just plug my color of my texture into the base color of our shader. It seems to be using the UV coordinates by default, but just to be safe, I'm going to press Shift A, then under input, I'll left click texture coordinate and plug my UV into the base color. Some of you might have noticed already, but we've got a couple of lines for our bake here, and that's because we haven't set a margin. So to fix this issue, I'm going to left click my base color, and I'll give myself a margin of, let's say, 8. Now I just need to take my base color for my procedural material back into the base color, since that's what we're going to be baking from. I'll reselect my base color texture, And now with our margin set to 8, we can just go ahead and press bake. Now that's finished, if we plug the base color of our base color texture back into base color, you can see the lines are now gone. Also, you'll notice beside image there's a star, and that indicates that a change has occurred and it needs to be saved. So I'll press image and then press save, and it will save automatically in the location you've chosen. Keep in mind this will override the image we baked on top of. And there we have it, we now have our base color texture, which you can go ahead and use in other blend files and in other softwares such as game engines and other 3D animation programs. Also, if you use them in Blender, it saves Blender having to calculate all this different stuff every time you load it up. Instead, it will only have to focus on loading up an image. But with that, I'd like to thank you all very much for watching, and if you did enjoy, please make sure to like the video, subscribe, and share with someone if you think they would find it useful. Thank you again, and take care. Last time, we learned how to texture bake the base color of this procedural material. So today, we'll be baking our roughness map / image texture. Now I'll just drag up this here, and now we can get a good look at our shader. Where this roughness input here is what we're going to be baking. Blender will bake the roughness of the shader that's plugged into this material output of this object. Next up, we need to have something that we can bake onto, and this will be an image texture. So I'll press Shift A, then under texture, I will left click image texture. I'll then click plus new, and here we've got a 1024 by 1024 square image. We're going to want to make this 2K, so I'm just going to times this by 2 by left clicking the top one, dragging my mouse down 1, left clicking the end of this number, press shift and then the number 8 key, which will create a star sign, and then 2, which will then times it by 2. Then all I need to do is press enter. Now we've got our 2K texture. I'll uncheck the alpha channel and just press OK. I'm going to change my color space to non-color, and now we have our image texture ready to be baked on. If I zoom out my UV editor, you can see it's created a plain black image under our UV. That's because we have this image selected. Next up, we need to set up our bake settings. First of all, we need to make sure we're in the cycles render engine, since texture baking is a process that occurs in cycles. Then in our render settings, I'm going to set my max samples to 10, since baking does not require a high sample count for rendering. And I'll just set my min samples to 0. In bake, I'll change my bake type to roughness. This will tell Blender to access the roughness from the shader plugged into the output. And also, I'm going to want to change my margin, since in the last video, when we didn't use a margin, it created some lines on our cube, which we didn't want. So again, I'm going to change the margin size to 8. That will create an 8 pixel margin size around each of our islands, which are these squares here. Now all that's done, I'm going to press Ctrl S, which will save our project. That way we'll be sure if Blender crashes, we can recover our file. I'll left click my image texture, which I'm actually going to rename from Untitled to Prismarine Roughness. Then all that's left to do is just to press bake. Now our bake is complete, you can see it in our UV editor. That means we can now use this image texture instead of the procedural nodes I've plugged into this roughness parameter of our shader. It also means we can use this image texture in other 3D softwares, allowing us to turn our Blender procedural materials into images we can use in Blender and in other software. First though, I'm going to need to make sure I save my image, since this image isn't automatically saved into Blender. That means that if I was to close Blender without saving it in this specific way, image would be lost. So to make sure that doesn't happen, where it says image with a star beside it indicating it hasn't been saved, I'm going to left click the image and then press save as, and then all I need to do is choose a location to save my file. Once you've saved the file, you'll notice that the image will not have a star beside it, indicating that it's been saved. If you make any changes to your image later, such as by baking it again to fix issues, all you need to do is left click image and then press save, and it will override it. I'll then press tab to go back into object mode, Z on the keyboard, and then go to rendered. I'm going to plug my image texture into the roughness just to preview what it looks like, and also to demonstrate that this image texture works as an alternative to using procedural nodes. So I'll plug my color into the roughness. It seems like the texture has been lined up perfectly, but just to be safe, I'm going to add the texture coordinate node to make sure it's accessing the UV's coordinates. So press Shift A, then under input, I'm going to left click texture coordinate. Then I'll plug my UV output of my texture coordinate into the vector of this roughness image texture. And there we go. Now you can see what it looks like. You'll notice in my render preview, we have some lighting already, and this can be found in the HDRI in the description below. But with that, I'd like to thank you all very much for watching, and if you did enjoy, please make sure to like the video, subscribe, and share it if you know someone who you think would find it useful. Thank you again for watching, and take care. In the last video, we learned how to texture bake the roughness of this procedural material, and today we'll be baking a similar type of map called a gloss map. A gloss map is basically an inverted roughness map and is used in some other 3D softwares. Since Blender works with roughness instead of gloss, we would use roughness maps in Blender. But sometimes we would want to turn our procedural material into a gloss map, so we can use that map in softwares which use gloss instead of roughness. I drag up my shader editor a bit more, and we're not going to need this texture here which we used in the last tutorial. So I'm just going to left click and drag these two nodes and press X to delete them. If you're starting this tutorial from the download in the description below, you won't need to do this because it will already be plugged in, but for you guys following from the roughness tutorial, you'll need to plug the roughness back in. Now I'm going to press Shift A and I'm going to create the image texture to bake our gloss map onto. So under texture, I'll left click image texture. I'll then press plus new and I'm going to change the name to Prismarine Gloss. Then I'm going to left click the width, drag my mouse down 1, select the end of the number, press the Shift key, the 8 key, which will create an asterisk or a star sign, which works as a multiplier, and then 2, and I'll times both the numbers by 2, giving me a nice 2K texture. You can also type in these numbers manually. I'll uncheck the alpha button and press OK. Here in our UV editor, you can see the image has been added, and it's just a plain black image just now. I'll change my color space to non-color. Now that's done, we can set up the bake settings. In my render properties panel, I'm going to make sure I'm in cycles, since texture baking is a cycles feature. Under the render sampling, I'm going to change my max samples to 10, since you don't need a high render sample for baking in Blender. Then under bake, I'm going to change my bake type to roughness, since it's the roughness channel we'll be baking from. And I'm going to set my margin to 8 pixels. Now if we were to press bake just now, we would just get a roughness map. And we want a gloss map, which if you remember as I mentioned in the beginning, is essentially an inverted roughness map. So I'm going to press Shift A and I'm going to left click the search bar and search for invert. In older versions of Blender, it'll just be called the invert node, and in this version, which is Blender 3.6, it'll be called invert color. So left click that and plug it in between these color ramp, which I'm using for my roughness, and the roughness shader parameter. Now that's done, I'll left click my Prismarine Gloss texture and I'll just press bake so we can start baking our gloss texture. Now our bake is finished, you can see it here in our UV editor, and you'll notice it is essentially got the opposite color scheme from the roughness map, as it should be. Now all we need to do is save this image. So where it says the image and the star icon indicating it needs to be saved, I'll press image and choose save as, and then I'll choose a location to save my file. It's really important that you save the image this way because the image file won't be saved when you save the Blender file. Meaning, if you were to save and close your Blender file, the image would be lost if you didn't save it by left clicking image and pressing save as. So make sure to do that. And there we have it. Now, if someone asks you to bake your procedural Blender texture into a gloss file, or if you want to use your procedural material in a software that uses gloss maps, now you know how to do it. If you ever get a gloss texture which you need to use in Blender, you can just plug it into the roughness and put an invert node in between. Don't forget to press Shift A, then under input, add a texture coordinate and plug your UV into your image texture. But yeah, with that, I'd like to thank you all very much for watching, and if you did enjoy the video, please make sure to like the video and share it with someone who you think would find it useful. Also, feel free to ask any questions if you have any, since gloss maps can confuse people, which is perfectly normal and part of the learning process. Also, I have 2 free PDFs in the description below, one which will teach you about maps in Blender and the different kinds you get, and another one which will cover how to bake all these different ones, which is what we've been doing today. Thank you again, and I hope to see you in the next video. Take care. In the last couple of tutorials, we learned how to texture bake the roughness and gloss maps of this procedural material, and today we'll be baking a type of map used for adding depth to our shader. These are called either height, bump, or displacement maps, and they're all more or less the same thing. Normal maps also allow us to add depth to our shader, but we'll cover these more performance-friendly texture maps in the next video. Now I'm going to drag up the shader editor so we can talk about what we're going to be baking. If I scroll down to my bump nodes, we're going to be baking 2 different height maps, one for this height here and another for this height here. The first one is what I've used to create the grooves in our object on the shader, and the second one is for some subtle surface imperfections. Some of you might be wondering why height maps have loads of different names such as bump or displacement, and that's because these maps also work with nodes such as the displacement node, displacement modifier, which you can find here, and sometimes it will be called bump, just meaning you want to plug it into the height of a bump. For example, if someone gave you a set of texture maps to apply to a Blender material, if it was called a bump map, they'd probably want you to plug it into a bump node, whereas if they gave you a displacement map, they would probably want you to plug it into a displacement. And if they give you a height map, it would probably be one of the two. But essentially, all three of these maps work with any of these nodes. It's more just a communication thing. So with that explanation out of the way, I'll get started with setting up my image so we can bake. So up here in this empty space, I'll press Shift A in my shader editor, and under texture, I'm going to left click image texture. I'll press plus new, and I'm going to call it Prismarine Grooves Height. And then I'm going to left click and hold my width, drag down 1, left click behind the last number, hold down the Shift key and press the 8 key, and that will create a times symbol, then 2, and now we've times it by 2, and we get a nice 2K texture. I'll uncheck the alpha, and then just press OK. I'll then change my color space to non-color, and if I zoom out in my UV editor, you can see we now have a plain black image under our UV. Now I'm going to set my bake settings. So I'm going to go to my render properties, make sure I'm in the cycles render engine, since that's where texture baking happens. I'll change my max samples under render to 10, since we don't need a high sample count for baking, and I'll just set my min samples to 0. Finally, under bake, I'm going to change it from wherever your default is to emit. Essentially what this means is Blender is going to bake using the emission channel of the shader plugged into the material output here. We're doing this since there isn't a specific channel to access the height. Then I'm going to set my margin to 8 pixels. Now in order to bake our height map, I'm going to plug my grooves, which is the first bump node. I'm going to plug this height input into the emission. Of course, this is going to kind of ruin our shader, but this is only temporary for the purpose of baking. Then I'm going to go ahead and left click my image texture, and we can go ahead and save the file. That way, if the Blender crashes while we're baking, we can come back to where we were. And with that, I'm just going to press bake. Now our bake is complete. You can now see in our UV editor, we have the height map we were looking for. Next thing I need to do is save the image, because even if I save and close the Blender file, the image won't be saved with it. So we need to save it separately. So where it says image with a star, this star indicates that it needs to be saved. I'll left click it, and then left click save as, and I'll choose a location to save this file. Once we've saved it, I'm going to go ahead and pull it to the side to use later. I'm also going to unplug my procedural grooves from the emission. And now I'm going to come down to the bottom here where we have our second bump node. I've got my surface imperfections plugging into the height. So I'm going to plug that into the emission so we can bake it. Now I've plugged everything in properly, I'm going to go ahead and create a second image texture. So I'll press Shift A, then under texture, I'll left click image texture. I'll then click plus new, and I'm going to change the name to Prismarine Imperfection Height. And it's already got it on 2K and turned off the alpha channel since that's what we done last time. So I'll just go ahead and press OK. I'll change my color space to non-color, left click it, and we can go ahead and press bake since we've already set everything up. Now our bake is finished, you can see our imperfections here. So I'm going to go ahead and left click image and then choose save as, and I'll save this image in another location on my computer. I've saved mine along with my other bakes. Now I've done that, I'm just going to go ahead and unplug our imperfections from the emission. Awesome, but you'll notice our shader is now missing its bump details, and that's because we unplugged them in order to put them in for baking. So I'm going to left click my image texture and shift left click the other one and just drag them down to the bottom here. I'll left click and box select these two nodes just to move them out of the way. Before I plug these into the height, I'm going to need to make sure they're accessing the UV coordinates, which means they'll access this UV unwrap here. So I'll press Shift A, then under input I'm going to left click texture coordinate. Plug the UV into the vector of both of these image textures. I'm going to plug my groove height into the first one since I've already got the strength and distance set up for that one, and I'll plug my imperfections into the height of the second bump node since that's set up as well. And there we have it. Now our depth details have been added again, and this is done without any procedural nodes, just with image textures which we've baked today. So with that, I'd like to thank you all very much for watching, and if you did enjoy, please make sure to subscribe, like the video, and there's also the YouTube thanks feature if you found it very useful and want to give me a small donation to help me make more videos. But any kind of support is greatly appreciated. Also, feel free to ask any questions if you have any, and make sure to check out these two PDFs here, learning about texture maps and how to bake these texture maps. But yeah, thank you very much again, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care. In the last tutorial, we learned how to texture bake the bump height inputs of this procedural material. Today, we'll be baking another type of map used for adding depth to our shader. These are called normal maps, and they are a much more speed-friendly option than height maps. There are two main types of normal maps that we'll be baking today. These are called OpenGL normal maps and DirectX normal maps, and they're used in different 3D softwares respectively. Now today, if I drag up my shader editor and scroll down, we're going to be baking what goes into this normal channel. So that'll be these two bump nodes turned into
into one singular map. And this map is a lot more resource friendly than doing the two height maps into bump nodes separately. As I explained, there are two types of normal maps, and to start off we're going to be doing OpenGL, which is the type of normal map that works by default in Blender. So I'll press Shift A, and then under texture, I'm going to left click image texture. We're creating this so we have something to bake our normal map onto. I'll then press plus new, change the name to Prismarine Normal OpenGL, just so it's nice and labeled. I'll then left click and hold the 1024px width and quickly drag down 1. Then I'll click behind the number 4, hold down the shift key, press the 8 key to create a time symbol, press the number 2, and then just press enter. And now we have 2048 by 2048, creating a nice 2K texture for us. I'll uncheck the alpha channel and just press OK. I'll change my color space to non-color. If I zoom out in my UV editor, you can see we got a plain black image, and that's the image we just created. Now we can go ahead and set up our bake settings. So I'll left click my render properties, make sure I'm in cycles since texture baking happens in cycles. Under my render sampling settings, I'll change my max samples to 10 and my min samples to 0. I can set a low count like this because baking does not require a large sample count. Then I'm going to change my bake type, which should be combined by default, to normal. Make sure all these settings and influence are the same, since the green channel is what we're going to be changing for the DirectX normal map. But for the OpenGL map, we can leave it at its default. Then I'm going to set a margin of 8 to make sure there's no errors. I'll then save my Blender file just to make sure if it crashes, we don't lose all our progress. I'll then left click my image texture in the shader editor and just press bake. Great, we finished baking and now we can see our normal map here. If I zoom in, we can see these look like protrusions, as they should, and that's usually how you can tell it's an OpenGL normal map. Now my bake is finished, I'm going to make sure I save my image. So where it says image with a star, I'll left click this and press save as. And then we can just choose a place on our computer to save the image. I've just saved it with my other bakes. It's important we do this because when we save the Blender file, it won't save the image automatically. You have to save the image separately that way. Then I'm just going to press Shift A, and then under texture, I'm going to left click image texture. And now we're going to bake our DirectX normal map. So I'll press plus new, then under name, I'll type in Prismarine Normal DirectX. I'm going to leave it at 2K for my texture, keep the alpha unchecked, and just press OK. I'll change my color space to non-color, and I'm going to leave all my bake settings as is, and as you can see, I've changed my green channel to -Y, and that's because DirectX normal maps have an inverted green channel, so we need to change it from the +Y, which is by default, to the -Y. Then I'll save my blend file, and with my image texture selected, I can go ahead and just press bake. Great, now we've finished baking, I'm going to zoom into my normal map in the UV editor, just to see what it looks like. And you can see, these look more like indentations where they should be protrusions, and that's usually what DirectX normal map will look like. Now I'm just going to go ahead and left click that image with a star beside it, left click save as, and I'm going to save this image as well. Now I'm going to left click and box select these two image textures and just drag them down to the bottom here. Before I show you how these two image textures work, you might be wondering how to know which one to bake. For example, if someone asks you to bake them a normal map of a procedural material you've made perhaps, you'll need to make sure they tell you whether or not they want a DirectX normal map or an OpenGL normal map. So make sure to ask them this if they haven't told you. If they're not sure, you can either bake them both in OpenGL and a DirectX, or you can find out what software they're going to be using the texture in, and just use what that software uses. For example, I believe Unreal Engine uses DirectX normal maps instead. So if you were baking this procedural texture, so your client could use it in Unreal Engine, making a DirectX normal map would make more sense. Whereas if they were going to use it in Blender, you would maybe want to make them an OpenGL normal map. But the great thing is, let's say you downloaded a set of texture maps from the internet to use in Blender, and one of them was a DirectX normal map. You could still use it because in Blender you can simply just flip the Y channel when using a DirectX normal map to achieve an OpenGL effect. So I'll show you how to plug in an OpenGL normal map, and then I'll show you how to do DirectX with the flip channel. So first of all, I'm going to unplug the normal of my bump since we're not going to need it now. Now you can see our depth details have disappeared as expected, and we can't just plug this texture straight into the normal. We have to use a normal map node. So I'll press Shift A, then under vector, I'll left click normal map, and I'll put this node here. And then I'm going to take my OpenGL one and plug the color into the color. I'll leave my strength at 1, but you can mess around with that value if you want to make it less intense. And I'm also going to press Shift A, then under input, I'll left click texture coordinate. And then I'm going to plug the UV into the vector. Essentially what this does is allows us to access this UV unwrap we've used here, so we get the result we want. I'm also going to plug the UV of this texture coordinate into our DirectX one, so we can switch between the two for demonstration purposes. And then I'm going to plug my normal into the normal of my shader, which is connected to the material output, which will then show us the depth details using the normal map. If I zoom in, you can now see these depth details taking place, noticing how it's not quite as detailed as using the bump node, but still quite a lot of detail nonetheless. Here's what it looks like with it unplugged. I'll press Ctrl Z to plug it back in, and now if I was to press Shift D to duplicate this normal map, plug my DirectX into the color here, and then plug this normal into the normal, you'll notice how the shading of the simulated depth has changed and it doesn't quite look as right. So to fix this, I'm going to add two new nodes in between my DirectX normal map and my normal map node. So I'll press Shift A, then under Converter, I'm going to left click Separate Color. I'll then press Shift A again, and under Converter, I'll left click Combine Color. And then I'm going to plug my green into the green, red into the red, and blue into the blue. Now essentially it makes it so nothing's changed, which is what we want. But we can now press Shift A, then in the search bar we can search for invert, and we can choose the invert color node and plug it in between the two green channels. And now you can see it looks just like the OpenGL map we've used. Notice how there's no difference now I've switched to the other one. And yeah, that's pretty much how you would use a DirectX normal map in Blender. So with that, I'd like to thank you all very much for watching, and if you do have any questions, please make sure to ask, since this topic tends to confuse people, which is perfectly normal and part of the learning process. Also, I've provided you with free PDFs which you can use to help you understand some of these concepts. I've got one on texture baking, and I've also got one on maps in 3D. But yeah, apart from that, if you do want to support the channel, you can like, subscribe, share with someone who you think will find it useful, or there's also the YouTube thanks feature if you want to donate some money to the channel, but any kind of support is greatly appreciated. Thank you again, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care.